I still remember the exact moment Margaret Hargrove looked right through me. Not at me, through me. Like I was a window, like I was a wall, like I was nothing but air taking up space in her perfect, spotless kitchen. I was standing 3 feet away from her, holding a tray of coffee she had asked me to prepare, and she was on the phone telling her friend, loudly, without a single care in the world, that she couldn't find good help anymore. I was right there, and that was the moment I knew. This family had a secret, and I was going to find it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all started, because honestly, I walked into that house with nothing but a suitcase and a prayer. I had no idea I was walking into the biggest mess of my entire life. My name is Rachel, and about a year ago, I was in a really bad place. I'd just gone through a breakup that wiped out everything: the apartment, the shared bank account, the whole life I thought I was building. I was 31 years old, sleeping on my younger sister Becca's couch in Columbus, Ohio, and honestly just trying to get through each day without completely falling apart. I had a background in household management. For about 5 years, I'd worked for a couple of wealthy families, organizing schedules, managing staff, handling travel arrangements, running the home. I was good at it. I knew how to be invisible when people needed space and present when they needed help. That's the job. So when a listing came up on a private staffing agency website for a live-in personal assistant position in a big house outside of Cincinnati, I applied without thinking twice. The pay was more than I'd ever made. The listing said the family was private, professional, and required discretion. I thought that just meant they were busy and didn't want their business in the street. I had no idea what that word, discretion, would actually mean. I got the job after one phone interview. They didn't even meet me in person first. That should have been my first red flag. But I was desperate, so I packed my bags and drove 3 hours south with everything I owned in the back of a Honda Civic. The Hargrove house sat at the end of a long, private driveway lined with oak trees. It was the kind of house that made you feel small before you even walked in. 3 stories, white stone, perfectly trimmed hedges. It looked like a magazine photo, beautiful and cold at the same time. Margaret Hargrove met me at the door. She was in her early 60s, blonde, thin, with the kind of posture that looked painful to maintain. She shook my hand once, firmly, like she was closing a business deal, and then walked me inside without smiling. She showed me the house quickly, like a real estate agent rushing through a showing. The kitchen, the living areas, the laundry room, the office where I'd manage scheduling. She spoke fast, didn't ask me questions, and referred to me twice as the girl, before we'd even been talking for 10 minutes. I corrected her gently. "Rachel," I said. "My name is Rachel." She said, "Yes, of course," and then called me the girl again 5 minutes later. Her husband, Douglas Hargrove, came home that evening. He was tall, well-dressed, silver-haired, and had one of those big, warm smiles that seems designed to make you trust him immediately. He shook my hand, said, "Welcome to the family," and laughed loudly at his own joke. I smiled back. He seemed easier to deal with than Margaret. Their son, Tyler, was 26 and lived in the east wing of the house. He barely said hello. He looked at me like he was nervous, not rude, just uncomfortable, like he'd seen people like me come and go before and didn't want to get attached. I didn't think much of it at the time. My room was at the back of the house, past the kitchen, near the service entrance. It was small, but fine. Clean white walls, a single bed, a tiny window. It had a lock on the door, but the strange thing was, the lock was on the outside of the door, like the room wasn't built for a guest. It was built to contain someone. I told myself I was overthinking it. I put my suitcase down, unpacked my things, and went to bed. The first 2 weeks were exhausting in a way that's hard to explain. It wasn't just the workload, though that was intense. It was the way they made me feel while I was doing it. Margaret gave me a printed list of duties every single morning slipped under my door before I was even awake. The list was always too long for one person to finish in a day. And when something didn't get done, she didn't ask why. She just gave me that look, slow, disappointed, like I'd personally let down generations of her family. I was expected to be available at all hours. One night at 11:30, she called me into the living room to ask me to reheat a cup of tea, not because she couldn't do it herself. I think she just wanted me to know that she could. When the Hargroves had dinner guests, and they had them often, I would cook the meal, set the table, and serve the food. The guests always complimented the cooking. Margaret would smile and say, "Thank you, we're so lucky." Never once did she say my name. Never once did she say someone else made it. I was just an extension of her household, a thing that made things happen. One evening, a guest asked who the chef was. Margaret looked up and said, "Oh, we have someone." That was it. We have someone. Like I didn't have a last name. Like I hadn't spent 4 hours in that kitchen. I called Becca that night. I sat in my little room and I said, "I feel like I don't exist here." She told me to come home. I told her I couldn't. Not yet. I needed 3 more months of paychecks to get back on my feet. I just had to get through it. So I stayed, and I kept my eyes open. It was around week 3 that I started noticing things that didn't add up. Douglas had 2 cell phones. Most people don't think about that kind of thing, but when you manage someone's schedule and handle their correspondence, you notice. He always kept the second one face down. He'd step outside to answer it, even in the middle of dinner. When I accidentally walked into his study once while he was on it, he hung up immediately and looked at me like I'd caught him doing something wrong. Margaret received an unmarked envelope on the 1st of every month. No return address, always hand-delivered by the same man, older, in a gray jacket, who never spoke and never came inside. She would take the envelope straight to the fireplace in the sitting room and burn it, every month, without fail. And then there was the East Wing. The East Wing was where Tyler's bedroom was, but it also had a locked room at the far end of the hall. I'd been told on day 1 that this room was storage and that I didn't need to go in there. The key was not on my household keyring. In 6 weeks of working there, I never saw anyone go in or come out of that room. But sometimes, late at night, I heard footsteps in that hall, back and forth, slow and steady, like someone pacing. I started talking to Tyler more, not about any of this, just small talk. He'd come into the kitchen late at night when his parents were asleep, and I'd be up finishing my list for the next day, and we'd just talk about nothing serious. TV shows, food. He was actually kind of funny when he relaxed. One night, I asked him casually how long he'd lived in the house. He said he'd moved back 2 years ago. I asked if he'd lived somewhere else before. His whole face changed. He said, for a while, and then got quiet and went back to his room. I didn't push, but I remembered. It was a Tuesday night when I found the paper. I was emptying the small trash bin near Douglas's study, regular part of my evening routine, and at the bottom, torn in half, was a piece of paper with handwriting on it. I almost didn't pick it up, but something made me. It was just a fragment. A woman's name, Claire Whitfield, and a date from 11 years ago. And underneath, in Douglas's handwriting, 4 words, "Must never come up." I stood in that hallway for a long moment, then I put the pieces in my pocket and went to my room. That night, I searched the name, Claire Whitfield, 34 years old at the time, a former bookkeeper for a company called Hargrove Capital, Douglas's private investment firm. She had gone missing 11 years ago. The case had been investigated and then quietly closed. No body was ever found. Her family had pushed for answers for years and gotten nowhere. And in one of the old news articles, a small local paper, barely a paragraph, there was a photo, a company event. Douglas Hargrove, smiling wide, arm around a woman with light brown hair and a yellow blazer. The caption read, "Douglas Hargrove with company staff at the annual Hargrove Capital dinner." The woman in the yellow blazer was Claire Whitfield. I sat in my small room at the back of that house, and I felt the floor shift beneath me. The next morning, I went to Tyler. I didn't show him the article right away. I just asked, as gently as I could, if he had ever heard of a woman named Claire Whitfield. He went completely still. Then he closed the kitchen door, sat down across from me at the table, and for the first time since I'd arrived, he looked at me like a real person, like I was someone he'd been waiting to talk to. He told me he was 17 when it happened. He said he didn't know everything, but he knew enough. He knew his father had been involved with Hargrove Capital in a way that wasn't clean, and he knew Claire had discovered something in the books. He said one day she was just gone, and no one in the family ever spoke her name again. His parents acted like she had never existed. He said he'd been living with it for 11 years, that it was part of why he'd left and part of why he came back. He said he couldn't stay away and couldn't stay silent at the same time. "I've been stuck," he said. "I didn't know what to do." I told him I did. The next week, Margaret called me into the living room and told me I seemed distracted. She said that if I couldn't maintain the standards of the household, she would have to explore other options. She said it pleasantly, with a smile, like she was doing me a favor by warning me. That same evening, I came back to my room to find that my things had been moved. Nothing was missing, but they'd been gone through. My notebooks, my laptop bag, my journal. They were suspicious. I wasn't scared. I was focused. I had already been documenting everything for days. Photos saved to a cloud account they didn't know about, dates and times written in a notes app behind a password. I had printed copies of the news article. I had Tyler's account written out in his own words, which he'd agreed to give me after we talked again. I found a journalist named Sandra Cole, who had written 2 pieces about Hargrove Capital years earlier, pieces that had never gone anywhere because no one would go on record. I sent her a message through her professional website. She responded within an hour. Over the next 4 days, Sandra and I talked every evening after the household went to bed. She knew things I didn't. I knew things she couldn't prove. Together, we were building something that couldn't be ignored. And then Tyler found the locked room key. He'd known where his father kept it for years, but had never had the courage to use it. He used it now. Inside the room were filing boxes going back more than a decade, financial documents, correspondence, and at the back of the bottom box, a sealed envelope addressed to Douglas Hargrove from a law firm, dated 3 months after Claire disappeared. Inside was a settlement agreement, a payment made to a man named Gary Cole, a contractor, in exchange for his silence about an incident on company property. An incident that, based on the documents around it, involved Claire Whitfield, a parking structure, a confrontation, and a fall that Douglas Hargrove had witnessed and walked away from without calling for help. He hadn't killed her, but he had let her die, and then he had paid someone to stay quiet about it, and then he had let her family spend 11 years not knowing. Tyler photographed everything on his phone. We sent the images to Sandra that night. I chose a Sunday morning for the confrontation. The whole family was home. Margaret was having coffee in the sitting room. Douglas was reading in the study. Tyler was in the kitchen with me. I walked into the living room first and asked Margaret to get Douglas. I told her I needed to speak to both of them about something important. She looked at me with that slow, dismissive stare, the same one she'd given me since day one, and she said, "Rachel, whatever this is, it can wait." I said, "It really can't." Something in my voice made her stand up. We all gathered in the living room. Douglas sat across from me, relaxed, completely unbothered, like he was about to hear a complaint about a dry cleaning bill. I laid the photographs on the coffee table. I laid out what I knew, calmly, clearly, without raising my voice even once. I told him about Claire Whitfield, about the documents, about the settlement, about the 11 years her family spent without answers, while he sat in this beautiful house and pretended none of it had happened. The color drained from his face. Margaret looked at the photos and then looked at me with something I had never seen from her before. Not contempt, not dismissal, fear. Douglas tried to recover. He leaned forward and, in a low voice, said they could work something out, that there was more to the story, that I should think very carefully about what I was doing. I told him Sandra Cole at the Cincinnati Gazette already had copies of everything, that it was already out of my hands, that the only person who needed to think carefully was him. He didn't say another word. I stood up, looked at Margaret, the woman who had looked through me since the moment I arrived, and I said, "You spent 6 months treating me like I wasn't there. That was your mistake, because I saw everything." I walked out the front door. My car was already packed. The story ran 10 days later. Sandra's piece was thorough, careful, and impossible to ignore. Within a month, a formal investigation had been opened into Douglas Hargrove. Hargrove Capital was placed under financial review. Claire Whitfield's sister, a woman named Donna, gave an interview to a local TV station. She said she had waited 11 years for someone to care enough to look. She cried on camera. I cried watching it from Becca's couch in Columbus. Tyler cut ties from his parents. He reached out to me a few weeks later to say he was okay. He was renting an apartment on his own for the first time in years. He said it felt strange and good at the same time. I told him I understood that feeling completely. And me? I was back on that couch. Back to square one, technically. No job, no savings cushion, no grand resolution tied up with a bow. But something was different. I had walked into that house with my head down, trying to be invisible, trying to survive, and I had walked out of it, standing completely upright. They never once asked me my last name. They never once asked where I was from, what I wanted, what I dreamed about. To them, I was a function, a convenience, a set of hands. But here's what people like the Hargroves never understand about the people who work in their homes, cook their food, and clean up after their lives. We are paying attention. Every single day that they looked past me, I was watching. Every meal I cooked while they talked about their lives like I wasn't in the room, I was listening. Every night I stayed late finishing a list that was too long on purpose, I was learning. They treated me like a servant, and servants see everything.